Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Women's Wisdom Hub with me, Amira.
And me, Caroline.
Hello. In today's episode, we have Lisa Etherson, who is a therapist as well as a coach and an author, who is kindly here to share with us her wisdom about shame, how she normally works with clients to process issues related to shame, but also how we can actually become much more aware of it in our day-to-day life. So today's episode is all about shame awareness, we thought. So welcome, Lisa.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you for coming. So, Lisa, would you like to maybe introduce yourself to our audience?
Yes. So, as you said, I'm Lisa Etherson. I'm a psychosexual therapist. I work in private practice, and it's lovely to be here talking about women and being with women, because the majority of my clients are actually men, not women. Although I have worked with women, obviously. But I'm also a PhD researcher. So, what that basically means is I'm in the middle of a PhD. And my topic for the PhD that I chose was shame. And out of that, I've produced a theory called Shame Containment Theory.
Lovely. Thank you, Lisa. I'm glad you've added that bit because, yes, we are very excited to get to know about this theory because I think you've also written about it as well. And I think you gave it the title, it's the Shame Containment Theory, isn't it? So I think one of the first things we thought discuss with you, it's about your book and what maybe inspired you to write about it, and how did you come to choose to actually, even in your research itself, to focus much more on shame?
The shame came from my own experience, which I think is often the way when it comes to being particularly interested in something. So it was because of my own experience of shame, probably around about 10 or 11 years ago. And that was the first time I was able to actually identify the feeling of shame or the emotion of shame, but also recognize that I had felt this before. So it was the first time I was able to name the experience as shame. That came from an awful event, but it transpired to completely change my life for the good, because I'm sat here talking to you lovely people about shame and having, really delved into the subject of shame. And the book came about, as I'm saying, it's probably grand to call it a book. It is a book, but it's an e-book. But basically, it's just about trying to get information out there on shame. It's about trying to develop a space where we can start having a conversation about shame, because there is such a taboo about shame.
Yeah.
There is shame about having shame often. And because of that, because we don't talk about shame, it can be difficult to identify, and it can be very difficult to put a language to. So this is one of the things that I think the theory that I've developed brings, is that we now have a language where we can start to understand shame, and then maybe we'll be able to talk about shame and not have as much shame as we often do have, because it is this real hidden emotion, and it's a very difficult thing to be able to express as well. And often that's because our first experiences of shame, not to be too therapeutic about this, but our first experiences of shame tend to be when we are under the age of being able to verbalize something, so what we would call pre-verbal stage. And that tends to stay with us, where we have this thing, but we don't necessarily know what it is, and so we can't name it. And it starts to really get in the way of the things we want to do and the relationships that we want to have, whether that be with partners or children or work colleagues. It's a very difficult thing to manage when we don't understand shame. So the point of having these types of conversations in the book is trying to help people to understand what shame is actually up to and why we have it, because there's a real purpose for shame, etc. So yeah, it's just the beginning of the conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you're quite right, Lisa, because it's quite often, is like you rightly said, is that thing we don't actually know how to point, or even we don't even know about it, but it translates into sometimes some of the difficulties people may have or face. So it's really good, I think in today's episode to kind of shed the light a bit on that and raise the awareness. In your book, you've described shame as a protective mechanism rooted in our attachment system, especially during childhood. I think, would you be able to explain how this understanding changes the way we view shame, as adults, and why, this perspective would be empowering?
I do think it's empowering, because for me personally, I found it to be very empowering when I came to the the realization that shame is actually part of our attachment system. So what we mean by attachment system is our attachments to our caregivers as children are the things that keep us safe. They're the things that help us to survive. It's really important to maintain an attachment bond to our caregivers, or that our caregivers remain our caregivers create an attachment bond to us as children. So where shame fits in with this is, and why I would consider it to be part of our protective, or has a protective element part of our attachment system, is that if something happens where there is what we call it a rupture or a disconnect in our attachment between our self and our caregiver, is this very, very small child, what can happen is that can be life-threatening to us, because it can imply that we're not necessarily going to survive, because that person, that caregiver, isn't going to find us very valuable. So therefore, something terrible could happen to us. They're not going to take care of us.
Yeah.
So shame comes up as a protective mechanism to get the child to change or modify their behaviour so that they can be seen as attractive again to their caregiver, and the caregiver will want to reconnect back up with them. Mm-hmm. So shame is very much about maintaining what we would call relational bonds with people. And we think that at first humans develop shame to make sure that they can be maintained as part of a group, because if we're outside of the group when we were first humans and we're not top of the food chain, that's when we're in real danger. There's just been this legacy of shame has continued when, we are top of the food chain now, but we still thrive in relational bonds, particularly as children. So shame will come up as, like I said, as a protective response to get us to change our behaviour. Now, it'll do it in a way that's really painful, because if it doesn't, we have the risk of not taking notice of that shame. So this is one of the reasons why shame can feel really painful, is because we really need to take notice of it. But unfortunately, we don't always have the story right when it comes to shame, or our shame doesn't have the story right. Yes. And one of the ways that it will try and protect us and get us to modify our behaviour is to tell us that we are bad, and that will help us to strive to be good. So if we're good, we're going to be seen as valuable by caregivers. But all aspects of shame are protective. And once we start to understand that, we can start to change our relationship with shame as well. We can start to figure out what it is that it's up to, what kind of message is it trying to give us. Is it accurate? Very often isn't particularly accurate at all. But I read an amazing blog a few years ago when I was looking at all of this stuff on shame, on the literature on shame, that described shame as an alarm system. And I think that's brilliant, because for me, that's exactly what it is. It's telling us that something isn't okay. It's very similar to anxiety. Anxiety will do exactly the same thing. Our anxiety is there to tell us that something's happening that is a threat to us, and our shame is very, very similar. But the difference is our shame will make us think it's about us. That is
this is the deceiving bit on shame, isn't it?
And really trying to get our attention. Yeah. So if we can view shame from that protective mechanism, but that it's not always having the story right, and we have to be very, very, very curious about what our shame is trying to tell us. It's often trying to say, if we behave differently, we are going to be able to be safer because we can maintain our position within this group. So we were talking at the beginning of the podcast about doing the school run. So, for example, perhaps some degree of shame when mothers are late for getting their children to school.
Yes.
The reason why the shame is there is because we don't necessarily want to have the consequences of what that means, of not being seen as the good mum. But so our shame is trying to protect us by saying you really have to get there on time. But it doesn't have the story right, as in, well, of course you're a good mum. Just because you're late doesn't mean that you're a bad mum. But it's trying to get you to behave in a particular way that keeps you as safe as possible.
So it's actually quite nice the way how you've actually explained it, Lisa, because it certainly felt to me it's more loud shame rather than it's that kind of word, like we said, it's a taboo and we tend to hide away from it. It's a protector, but also motivator. So I guess...
Yeah. It's interesting having the idea of shame as a motivator, because often when you see things written about shame, the idea is that shame isn't very motivating. From my perspective, shame is one of the most motivating factors we can have as humans, because it will either get us to retreat and move away, or to move forward and do something. But either way, we're motivated to take action, whether it's to disappear or whether it's to present bigger or larger or more. So we tend to become more or less than. So if you think about, perhaps there might be some women listening today who feel like they have to do more and more and more in their job. That's to protect them from the shame that might be coming if they're not being seen as doing enough. So they have to be more. They have to be perfect. They have to really strive.
Yes.
Because in the world that we live in,
common issue I think a lot of women share, isn't it?
Yeah, we can be shamed for not being enough, which is ridiculous. But it doesn't mean that shame actually has the story right, but it's still trying to protect us by putting us into a different position. So the shame as a motivator, from my perspective, is absolutely right. It is one of the biggest motivators that we have.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. That's really, really interesting. And just sort of following on from that, in the book, you make a distinction between contained shame and uncontained shame.
Yeah.
And just wondered, and I know you've mentioned as an example about mums on the school run, but whether there's any kind of real life examples maybe that you could give our audience about how those two different forms, that contained and the uncontained shame, kind of present themselves. And, is this on a kind of spectrum? And is there any way that we can help someone to navigate their emotions better?
Yes. So to describe the difference between contained and uncontained shame. So in contained shame, it's also what we might call trait shame. So it's who we think we are. It's our identity. So it could be, so if we use the example of the school mum, because it's a really good example, because it's something that most people, well, a lot of women will experience. So contained shame, when we're thinking about the school run, might be, I'm the worst one because I'm always late. I'm always the last there. I'm not good enough. I should be better. So it's a sense of who we are. It's a sense of self. A lot of people might be talking about self-esteem and having low self-esteem, but really from my perspective, again, what they're talking about is contained shame. So it's this idea of not being enough, or again, being too much. So again, it's about who we feel like we are. So in uncontained shame, this is what we call state shame. So we are in an acute state of shame. And that might be, so if you go back to the school mum, where a teacher, maybe comes out and criticises that school mum in front of all the other mums. And I should imagine that happens very often, but just to give an example.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen is that contained shame that the mum might be already feeling, I'm not good enough, I'm always last, I'm the worst of the mums in the playground. When something happens, often uncontained shame as well happens as a shock, but that contained shame erupts out, it comes outwards, and we feel it. So all of that contained shame that is there suddenly gets felt in a very, very, in a very acute way. And it's often when we're seen in a way that we don't particularly want to be seen. So like I said, uncontained shame can often come as a shock. So how I often visualize it is, it's almost like a jack in the box. So you've got the lid pressed down, something will happen, and the lid of the uncontained shame will suddenly come up, and the jack bounces out. And then what we need to do is we need to try and find a way to put that jack in the box back, put the lid back down. So
and that uncontained shame, just sort of trying to sort of imagine being in that position, that sounds kind of worse almost than the contained shame, because it's unexpected.
It's unexpected. Yes, it is worse than the contained shame, because in contained shame, although we might not necessarily be describing it as shame, we know it's there. It's often our internal narrative that we have anyway. But in uncontained shame, it's usually something that happens that we're not prepared for, that we haven't planned for, that we haven't been able to protect ourselves from, for example. But so you asked the question, Carol, about whether it's on a spectrum. And uncontained shame is definitely on a spectrum. So it can be, embarrassment can be part of uncontained shame, right way through to feeling like we are literally going to be destroyed and annihilated and never going to survive this situation, which is much rarer, but that does happen on occasion. So what we're talking about, the common experiences of uncontained shame are obviously generally a lot lower down that spectrum, but still feel very uncomfortable, and still something that we really don't want to avoid. We definitely want to avoid, because it's painful. It's that, that acute pain of shame is what we're talking about there.
And yeah, thank you, Lisa, for kind of explaining the difference between those two. Yeah, just kind of wondering how if that happens, that contained shame or the uncontained shame, what can be helpful, what can people do when that happens to try and navigate those emotions better?
It's a very tricky one because I suppose you've asked me a question that I might take 10, 12, 13 sessions to sit through with a client. But one of the things about shame is it's about disconnection. It's about human relationships, and it's about feeling disconnected from ourself, but also from others who are important to us, or even others who aren't really particularly important to us. Again, I'm thinking about the schoolyard and about perhaps some mums who aren't in your circle, but you feel shame because something has happened in front of them. But it will always be about disconnection generally, and about the risk of being ostracized and being on the outside, which for humans can be life-threatening. Again, if you go back to first humans, that's not the position that we want to be in. So one of the things that you can do with regards to being in a state of uncontained shame is trying to develop some connection as quickly as possible. And by that, what I mean is the connection with a safe person. So one of the things that I speak to my clients about, and one of the things that I do myself as well, is I have safe people that I can reach out to if I have a moment of uncontained shame, because we all do. It's a human thing. That's the other thing that's really important about shame, is all humans have it because we're supposed to have it because of that protective part, and because it's part of our attachment system. So even someone who works with shame and thinks about shame all the time, I will still feel uncontained shame at moments. And one of the things that I do to manage that is connect with my safe people.
Right.
I don't necessarily have to say anything about what's going on, or I might not necessarily use the word shame. I might not say I'm in a state of uncontained shame. It doesn't matter. It's about feeling that connection with that safe person, that I can go back into myself and say, okay, I'm safe. I'm okay. This is okay. This will pass eventually. But I think the other important thing is understanding the purpose of shame and why we have it. And once we understand the protective element of shame, we can be more curious about why it's there. So even contained shame is protective, because contained shame, the shame that's telling us that we're not good enough, will motivate us, as you said to me, right? It's very motivating. Will motivate us to perhaps try to get
new
to
things,
school.
and kind of move away from that sort of a comfort zone, and take some risks, isn't it? So then we can flourish and grow.
Yeah. So it's very paradoxical when it comes to shame. So a protective element of shame and the contained shame of not being enough does protect us from doing things that are risky. And it could be that those things are risky.
Yes.
But equally could be that they're not. And that's where we have to be really curious about, okay, so what's my shame trying to tell me? Does it have the story right? Is it really that life-threatening if I do this particular thing? If I speak on stage in front of 200 people, what is it really going to be like? But shame, so what we're talking about there actually is shame anxiety. So we have anxiety about doing things. But often if you think about the anxiety that we're feeling, if we take that anxiety to its natural conclusion, it's often that we're worried that we'll feel ashamed or shame at the end of something. So if we speak on stage and we put ourselves out there and we take a risk of making ourselves vulnerable, if we do something wrong, it's shame that we're going to feel. So our anxiety is about the shame that we're going to feel, as opposed to just being anxious about being So that's one of the
a really
ways that it tries to
interesting
protect
paradox,
us.
isn't it, between anxiety and shame?
Yeah, it's about telling us not to do the thing. But so curiosity. So I think really the take-home messages for me would be about shame being protective. It's a human emotion that we're supposed to have. It's really trying to be helpful, but it doesn't always have the story right. And how can we be more curious about what it is that it's trying to tell us? And I'm conscious that it sounds possibly quite glib when we're talking about it here on a podcast, because when I am working with my clients, it can take a long time to get to that point of feeling comfortable and feeling okay with shame. But that's the ultimate aim for me, is just helping people to understand what their shame is really up to.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. We've got a couple more questions, haven't we, Amira?
Yes.
Before we let you go, if that's okay.
Of course.
So you've also talked, and I think it's within the same, I think we're going, I think, in the same line. You've mentioned as well in your book about the inner critique and the inner protector versus the inner protector, and how people can actually reframe, the inner critique. I suppose about reframing the relationship with that, part of shame, which is the inner critique, as the inner protector. So would you like to tell us a
Yes,
little bit about
certainly.
that,
And this is
Lisa, and how
something that
people can reframe that, and what do you
yeah,
mean by the inner critique and the inner protector?
yeah. So I suppose inner critic is a very therapeutic term, isn't it? It would be a term that we would all be used to as therapists. But what we basically mean is um, that inner voice that tells us that we're not okay, or that we are bad, or we can't do that thing, or we're
Oh, you're not
stupid, or
good
we're
enough.
useless.
You're failure. You're worthless.
Yeah,
All that sort of
all of
negative
that stuff.
self-talk, isn't it?
So it's what us as therapists would call the inner critic. It's that self-critical voice. But if you look at shame through the lens, so I think the inner critic is basically a shame voice. And if you look at shame through the lens of shame being protective, basically what your inner critic is trying to do is trying to keep you away from the thing that is going to potentially bring you some degree of vulnerability, or again being seen. So if it tells you that you're so useless that you can't possibly go for that job promotion, if you don't go for that job promotion, generally you're safer because you haven't been seen. You're not risking the potential of being turned down or rejected as we might perceive it.
Mm.
So what your inner critic is trying to do essentially is trying to protect you. So again, when you shift that, or when you reframe it from it being a critical voice to a protective voice, the protective voice starts to change. The tone changes, the words change, and then you can step in and be curious.
Mm.
So again, it comes back to the idea of protection and curiosity. Okay, so what's the worst thing that could happen if I do go for this job?
Mm.
And I'm not the right candidate, or whatever it might be. It's the language that we use with ourselves is really, really important. And one of the things that happens when shame develops as part of our attachment injuries as a young child is we develop shame scripts. And our inner critic is part of that shame script. But ultimately, its job is trying to protect us. It's just not doing it in a particularly great way. It's doing it in a very forceful way, and often doing it in a way that's highly successful because we often don't do the thing that we might want to do.
Yes.
For the risk of that exposure and vulnerability and being seen. And, if you put your head above the parapet, often it's going to get shot. So your inner critic is trying to keep you away from the potential of that and try and shut you down and keep you as safe as possible by just not moving, generally by not doing anything at all. Yeah. So again, it's about, for me, understanding what its job is and naming that job accurately, even if it's doing it in a way that doesn't feel very kind. But once we give it its correct label as a protector, the tone, in my experience at least, the tone does change.
Absolutely, yeah. And I suppose there's also getting the audience to think about when they find themselves in that situation. It's about thinking about the costs of not doing something. That sort of inner critic voice is telling them, no, you've got to be safe. You shouldn't try that. What are they actually, what are the costs of that? What are they losing on?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and those messages are often childhood messages as well, aren't they? That if you think about where the inner critic develops from, these shapes develops from us at being a very, very young age. We still have them as very capable adults. And we don't need those messages as much anymore because we are capable of doing the things that we want to do. But because we've not necessarily been able to have that conversation with that part of us, that shame, to say, actually, no, we're okay. We can do this. We have got this. We have got the resources. We have got people around us to help us do these things now. We do have enough strength to put ourselves out there and take a bit of a risk.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. So the last question was around kind of breaking the silence around shame. So I guess that's what this podcast has been really, really helpful to do, because it can often be seen as a taboo subject. And like you said, it can be difficult to recognise as well, if we are feeling shame. Like you said, it's really important to be curious about shame. But yeah, just sort of wondering about how for people listening, about how individuals and communities can begin to try and create spaces where shame can be kind of acknowledged and discussed openly without fear of judgment. I suppose that, just kind of reflecting on that, and any thoughts you might have around that through the research that you've done.
I think it's a difficult thing, isn't it? Because we are in a culture where shame is hidden and shame is taboo generally. But I think for me, shame is a real leveler. This is how I relate to shame. Not everyone might have experienced depression, and not everyone might have experienced trauma or anxiety necessarily, but the chances are that we really have all experienced shame, because again, we're supposed to. It is there to keep us safe, but we haven't necessarily named it before. So I'm thinking from a cultural perspective, perhaps in a work environment, you have a culture within a work environment that the leaders and the managers are going to be feeling shame just the same as everybody else within that organisation. I don't really think anybody really gets away with it. And people who often appear shameless, that's often because they have so much shame that they can't actually go anywhere near it at all, but they're still responding from a perspective of trying to avoid shame. So even people who appear shameless don't really get away with shame. So I think it's perhaps the acknowledgement for me that we actually all have it and we're supposed to have it. If we were in a shameless society, well, we wouldn't have survived. It's shame actually that helps us to function when that shame is allowed to be there. And it's things like politeness. Politeness is a strategy. It's what I call a shame containment strategy. Politeness is a strategy that we use to maintain a pro-social connection with the people around us. If we didn't have politeness, then
consequences if
we wouldn't be considered to be likable, and we might then get ostracized. And so it's perhaps just thinking about shame in a different way. And that's what we're doing tonight as well, isn't it? The conversation is starting. I think you kind of answered your own question in many respects. This is the part of that shift in shame, that we can sit down and have a podcast and have half an hour talking about shame, and yourself, Carol and Amira, being really curious about, okay, so what's this thing all about? Can we actually have a conversation with it? So I think it's starting, and I think it might be slow, but it's about having, to, I suppose, coin Brené Brown, it's about having brave conversations, because it is brave to have a conversation about shame when perhaps what we really want to do is ignore and pretend it's not there.
That's really helpful, Lisa. And I'm just thinking that, anybody watching this podcast can, I'm sure, relate to this podcast and all the fantastic information that you've given in the podcast, and, kind of reflect on their own experience of shame, and hopefully maybe talk to some people that they feel safe and comfortable with about that as a starting point. And, we can all do that, myself and Amira as well. Yeah, thank you. That it's been really, really helpful and insightful talking about shame.
Thank you very much for having me.
And maybe the first step, we want the audience is watching us to maybe start to leave comments and not feel any shame about leaving comments. In the comment section. Also, for all the viewers, we'll be kind of delighted to put on the description box for you the link for Lisa's website, as well as her actual book and research about containment, shame and containment, for you to actually, for anyone who would like to access that. So we will pop the links on the description box, so make sure you check that. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you
very much, Lisa. It's been great, been really insightful. And thank you, everyone, for watching. And we'll see you next time for another podcast. And it's goodbye from us for now. So goodbye, everyone. Take care. I'm sure you found that helpful, that podcast from Lisa. Bye.